Turn on my mic, please. Thank you. Okay, it's 4:30 p.m. It's Monday, October 18th. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Strategic and Legacy Management Committee meeting. My name is Bob Dorr. I'm the chair of the committee. And our committee members. Do we have a slide for committee members? Okay. Well, we have committee members, and I'll just name them very quickly. I am the chair. Dave Hoyle is the vice chair. Gil Allensworth, Rose Dobson Elliott, Dan Kaminsky, Jim Lyon, Earl Shepard, Nina Spinelli, David Dovakis, and Mary Weber. I'd also, at this time, would like to ask if we have anybody online attending. Hey, Dave. Welcome to the meeting.
Hi, thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. We want to encourage participation at the meeting today. I want to stress to everyone that the meeting, this meeting is being recorded live, and so it's always a good practice to not speak into near the microphones when someone else is presenting and talking. We're going to stick to the agenda as much as possible, and there will be a public comment period where other comments can be heard. I'm just reading the script here. Anyone wishing to answer questions or address the CAB should come forward to the microphone that's to my right to speak. And to ensure the online attendees can hear the comments or questions. There is no public comment sign-up sheet. I do want to remind the CAB members that we do have a CAB sign-in sheet, and so please sign in if you're here. Okay. We have a recommendation update, and we have two recommendations that are open. Recommendation 346, drone spotting over SRS. That's we've got that as a pending recommendation. Not quite sure on that one. I thought we had closed that. No? We hadn't closed that recommendation?
I think we got the response before the last committee meeting.
All right. Okay.
I think I just conferred on that in the last week. I thought I saw it come across my email. So I think it's in the works.
Oh, there's an update from DOE on that, you mean, Pam?
I'm just telling you, I believe. My recollection is I think it came through for concurrence so recently, so I think it's processing is what I'm trying to tell you.
Okay. Okay. Well,
I don't know if Avery has any better knowledge.
well, we're going to keep 346 open for this meeting then. We're waiting a response. 347, curation facility. We have a response from DOE, and we're going to discuss that this evening. And then for the record, I brought this up at the full board meeting in September. Recommendation 338 involves the community involvement plan. And David Hoyle was the recommendation manager on that, and actually the original author. I'm not sure that we got we had an acceptable response from DOE in regards to 338. We were awaiting some information from the EPA. So I'd like to read into the record that 338 is still an open recommendation as well. Okay. Tonight's agenda, we start out with a point of contact status update from a previous recommendation, and that's going to be presented to us tonight by Zachary Todd. So Zach, I'm going to ask you to come up now. Thank you.
Zach Todd, DOE. Thanks, Bob. Got 4 topics for y'all today. The updates on the budget, strategic plan, life cycle, and just a general military update. For the life cycle, last year's life cycle assumption that all work on the site will be complete by 2065 held. The approved life cycle resulted into a $600 million cost savings over the life of the SRS mission. Most of these savings were derived from change in underlying assumptions, small changes, and more refined cost estimates. Also, liquid waste was accelerated by 1 year, and I think that was a recommendation of the regulators, if I'm not mistaken. Currently, we're going through the review for this fiscal year's life cycle update, and we're expecting approval in spring 2018. For the budget, the site just received its first allotment of fiscal 18-year funding during the continual resolution that runs through 8 December. The site is working through EM headquarters during talks with Congress regarding the funding levels for the full fiscal year 18 appropriations bill. And we've communicated back to OMB several priorities that regarding the fiscal year 19 request. For the strategic plan, even though that EM 1 and 2 or the DOE spots are filled now, we haven't had any communication with headquarters regarding the strategic plan. It's my understanding that the Office of External Affairs and they're going to have a meeting in the next coming weeks to kind of discuss the path forward for that. See if we can re-engage them on that. Military training is ongoing. Past couple months, we kind of put together several projects and stuff for the military to kind of work through next summer. Currently, we're not expecting any military projects to happen. Just with all the natural disasters and the troops being deployed, it's not looking feasible at this time. So, do I ask for questions now, or are we doing questions still for me?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Any questions?
Yeah, Zach, go ahead. Anybody?
Zach, would you mind repeating what you said about the life cycle cost estimate?
Which part?
The very first part that you discussed.
The 2065?
Yeah.
Yeah, so currently the site mission takes us out to 2065, and that assumption held. It's not a lot of debate, but there was some discussion about it to see if that was going to move at all. But 2065 is the end of SRS's mission as far as it relates to EM.
I'm trying to understand what the discussion was, whether to elongate that life cycle or to shorten it. What was it?
Not entirely sure. I can kind of follow up and see what the discussion was, but I talked to the point of contact earlier last week that deals with that. Apparently, it was kind of in discussion, but he kind of brought it up as a point that you would like to probably hear. But as of right now, what I got for you is 2065 is what the approved life cycle takes us to.
And you mentioned that resulted in some sort of cost savings?
That did not, separate topic, but the approved life cycle, the last year's approved life cycle.
Last year?
Yeah, resulted, it was a $600 million savings than what we currently project. So the life cycle cost, I think, is something to the tune of like $70 or $80 billion that from now till 2065. And the newest, most updated and approved life cycle was the $600 million difference from the last one. So it resulted in a savings.
Can we get a copy of this life cycle cost estimate?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I mean, that's something that we can look at. I don't know if that's published or not.
What do you attribute the $800 million savings to?
600 million and
600?
Yeah. So, 2065, there's a lot of things that kind of go into it. It's very impressive. It's a pretty big effort, but so a lot of what resulted in these particular cost savings are more refined cost estimates. So when we do cost estimates, especially for work that's 30, 40 years out, they're very much like budgetary placeholders. So they're not very little scope attached to them. It's a planning number. As we get closer to some of these events, we actually do cost estimates where we're attaching more and more and expanding the scope and the definition, and we're able to get more accurate numbers associated with that. So that's some of them. And then, like with every year, some assumptions change. Like, based off of certain orders or certain guidance that comes down, like assumptions are changed. Real broad example would be, if we have to have, if we're getting something and we have to have more security with it, that's something that could affect the number with it. Or if we don't get something and we have to have less security, those type of things, like overarching assumptions. And that's not a real example. That's just something I made completely up in my head. But those are just, disclosure there.
Well, I'm trying to understand the savings, but I believe I heard you say that the assumptions, at least for last year, didn't have a significant change, nor will they this year in terms of the life cycle estimate.
Well, so this past approved one, 1 year, one less year for liquid waste operations, I'd call that significant. But
So that's the difference?
no, that's not the difference. That probably resulted in a cost increase because you're crashing a schedule. You're putting more resources and at a higher output. But no, so there's thousands of variables. You can't attribute it to like one thing, but the majority of things, or the savings, the $600 million difference. So if you stack up, we'll just say the previous approved, we'll just say it's 70 billion, and you come to the most recent 69 billion 400 million. That 600 difference primarily was there's some underlying assumptions that change, kind of like the example that I gave you, and I'm pretty sure we can't discuss those. And then there's the cost estimate difference as well. So as we start getting closer and closer to these scopes of work, we get more and more refined cost estimate. We start dedicating more resources to this. Okay, hey, this project is, we'll just say 10 years out. We need to have a better idea of like how are we going to approach this and what it's really going to cost. We know we've had it in this little placeholder on the shelf for, we'll just say $200 million. And now we're going to, that was just like a ish number. Now we're going to dedicate like a cost estimator to it, some cost engineers, and find out, hey, this is the technical requirements, and that equals, we'll just say $173 million, plus or minus whatever the range is.
And this 2065 end of life cycle is only for the EM mission, correct?
Correct. This is the
Not-
EM mission.
The SRS doesn't go away in 2065,
No.
just the EM mission.
No, my understanding is there's always going to be ongoing things at Savannah River site
Okay.
to some degree.
Well, Chelsea, would you mind taking an action to try and obtain that last year's approved life cycle estimate for us? I think that's
Absolutely.
kind of interesting. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Oh.
Yeah, I just had, this is Dan Kaminsky, CAP. On the continuation of funding, since you obviously don't have your full budget to deal with,
Yeah.
can you describe to the CAB the types of projects that are being held up or deferred because you can't fully commit to these? Or are you just plugging away
So it's
slower?
there's a lot of there's not one like right answer. Like, sir, there's probably things that are being held up, but there's things that we just control the burn on a little bit better. That so we slow down progress, if you will, because we're held at a certain funding level, and maybe some of these projects are above that funding level, but then there's some projects that are probably going through just the way that we planned as well. So you're going to get a mixed bag of things, and I couldn't give you a specific example on each.
Okay, but is it, I mean, do you see any of the projects being significantly impacted time-wise because of the trickle-in funding?
I don't think significant. I mean, of course, it hurts. Like a continuous resolution. It's always like it's become common practice, but it's not an ideal situation. You want the full funding that hopefully that was approved or will be approved. So it's less than ideal, but significantly in the scheme of things. So like if you take it up to the life cycle, or meeting like regulation milestones, not to my knowledge that it's being affected.
And does any of the data show that that type of funding has a detrimental impact to overall costs?
I don't know if we've done a thorough data analysis on that, but I think you have a pretty good idea like what that answer would be. Like,
Well, I'm sure it would be. I would predict that it is impacting costs because you're deferring some things,
Sure.
but you're saying that's not really deferring a lot. But I would suspect it gives people the opportunity to not lock in price early.
Yeah, so, for sure, some things are deferred, some things continue as normal, some things are just, like I said, it's.
So
it's a
no
mixed bag.
analysis has ever been made, whether that's like a 1%, 5%, 10% impact?
I'm not sure exactly to that degree. I know we understand the impacts, like it's a pretty big to do, like, hey, continuous resolution up through 8 December, like there's a lot of impacts with that, and the contractors and stuff, they go back and they look at all the impacts. Now, is it put into a percentage, like, hey, this is going to cost you 3.6% more because we were delayed 3 months in this? I don't know. Maybe. I haven't personally seen it.
Could I make a comment?
Sure.
So they do it on a project basis. This is Tom French, the cab. They work on a project basis. They look relative to a project what the impact is based on the spending. And since they're still at 2016 spending levels and they'd like to be higher, according to Jack's last talk, I'm sure it's having an impact, but they calculate it based on a specific budget, specific scope. I don't know that they roll it into one big ball so that you can say this has 3% for the site.
Well, I'd even be interested on specific project level. Are we seeing specific projects with significant detrimental cost or timing impacts because of the way we get our funding?
We could sure ask for like liquid waste, and they could probably tell you what liquid waste impact would be.
But that's just one facet of
Yeah, I mean,
DOE's mission here.
yeah, I mean, like there's thousands of things going on, and a lot of it depends how you define significant. Like again, if you relate to the life cycle, probably I don't think you're in danger of without looking at anything being significant. But for sure, there's an impact. Yeah.
There's an impact, they just can't say what.
Well, no, I mean, there's between significance and impact. Like, so significant, like nothing's getting pushed to the left or pushed to the right for 5 years. I call that significant. Now, something being delayed a few weeks or a month, or maybe we have to hold on the planning of a particular project that we need to support certain operations. Yeah, there's an impact to that, but significance, I'm not so sure. So I think there's a difference in the words.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions for Zach? Zach, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, the next part of our agenda involves the committee discussion. So if you have your agendas in front of you, the committee discussion includes a review of the DOE response for recommendation number 347, curation facility. It also involves a draft recommendation that we received involving SRNL, Savannah River Nuclear Lab, the funding for it. That recommendation was drafted by Nina Spinelli. Nina's not here this evening, but we can have the discussion about it.
She is. She just appeared.
Oh, Nina. Okay. Nina Spinelli is here, and so you'll get the opportunity to field some questions regarding your draft recommendation. And I'm not sure if I invited or recognized everyone other than the normal Strategic and Legacy Management Committee members here. Tom French is here. Okay, and Bobby, you're not on this committee, or? No, I'm not. But you're welcome to come. So thank you for being here.
Yeah.
And was there anybody in the from the public that's not DOE? Would you like to just recognize yourself for the meeting?
Steve Battler.
Steve, welcome. And
Joseph Newell, I retired from SRS 6 months ago.
okay, Joseph, thank you for coming to the meeting. All right. So getting back to our committee discussion, why don't we start with the DOE response for recommendation 347, the curation facility. Now, I for one have seen this response, and I'll make the point that we received affirmative or positive responses from DOE on all 5 recommendations. The responses we received, in my opinion, involve, you know, like, we're looking for more access by the public to the historical artifacts of the, of SRS. But of course, there's always some limitations, but then there's some, you know, what was asked for in this recommendation were involvement by the, you know, the museum, the Savannah Riverside Museum. And then I noted there was some issues in regards to the museum, and it was not it was not up to spec per the, what was it, the
Interior.
Department of Interior. That's what I was looking for. But then there's been some remediation to that. So DOE wants to share artifacts from the curation facility with the museum. I think I'll just make the opinion that, my personal opinion, that I thought the response was pretty good and affirmative for the most part. But I'd like to now ask the committee members and other SRS CAB members who are here and the public to comment on the response to this recommendation. Do we have any questions, concerns?
David Hoyle, Cab, I share your opinion, Bob, that these responses from DOE appear to accept all of the sub-recommendations, and it looks good to me. I did notice in the paper today that the Heritage Museum is sponsoring an exhibit this week of robotics that looks like it would be interesting to see. Savannah Riverside Robotics.
Okay, thank you, David. Yeah, I saw that same, I think it was a Aiken Standard news blast about the robotics at development at SRNL. And that sounded pretty interesting as well. Any other comments? Nina, you were the original author of this recommendation. Do you have any public comment to make about it?
Nope, Nina Spinelli, Cab. I don't, and I'm really happy that so many of the subparts were accepted and partially accepted. I think this was the best response that we could hope for with it.
I agree. I'm going to make, is there a motion within the committee to accept this recommendation?
Motion.
Or the response? Okay. There's been a motion made. Would anybody like to second the motion for this committee to close this recommendation?
I'll second.
Okay, it's been seconded. All those committee members who agree, let's raise your hands, please.
Did you state the motion? I mean,
Oh,
motion
I'm sorry. The motion.
to the full board, right?
Yeah, the motion is that this committee is accepting and acknowledging that they'll close the recommendation based on this response, and that we'll move it forward to the full board for acceptance and closure of this recommendation. So that's the full motion, and I assume that that's been seconded, and we need to vote on that as a committee. So I'm going to ask to have that vote. Thank you.
All those in favor of
So all those in favor of taking it to the full board?
Right.
to-
All those in favor of taking it to the full board for closure of the
For
recommendation?
closure.
Okay, so, yeah, David Vovakis, how do you vote?
I'm having problems with the audio here, but I think I'm voting in favor.
Okay,
I am voting in favor.
thank you, Dave. Okay, so was there any non-votes or negative votes against that? No, there were not. Any public comment? Okay. All right, so this committee has accepted this recommendation response from DOE, And we're recommending to the full board to close this recommendation at the next full board meeting in November. Thank you. Okay, let's talk about the draft recommendation authored by Nina Spinelli regarding SRNL, Savannah River Nuclear Lab, the funding for it. And again, I think this is a good, my personal opinion is this is a good draft recommendation. I, for one, 3 years ago, prepared a position paper when we had those at the time, basically talking about the same thing, that SRNL is doing a lot of good work for the nation, for SRS, for the EM mission, and that it needed to be right at the top of the line in terms of funding by the federal government. So, Nina, you're the recommendation manager for this recommendation. Would you like to lead the discussion at this point?
Thank you, Bob. So I'm not going to read the background because I think y'all have had time to read it, and a lot of it is from the presentation that we recently had. So the recommendation is really simple. It's work with the Savannah River National Lab to evaluate how base funding from the federal budget could be requested and established, and evaluate the lab to determine what budget projections would be needed for base funding. For those of y'all that were, I think everyone was at the Charleston meeting, that was something that we asked several times, and my understanding, and Pam, maybe you can help clarify it just in case I'm wrong, was that this national lab, I think, was one of the only ones that didn't receive base funding in the budget. The funding came from mission work, and that's how the lab was funded. And so a lot of people asked questions about that and talked about how base funding could help the lab grow. So that's where this recommendation came from. I kept it pretty simple because I know that the budget is something we often talk about. So I wanted it to not get into too much depth. So any thoughts or feedback on it is always helpful.
Having Tom French, the cab, having suffered through the budget for many years, I think it's a very good recommendation. It's nice and simple and very straightforward. And it gives them an opportunity to have a dialogue. I know they've been doing it for several years, but I think this is good for the cab to put something like that forward.
Yeah. Bob Dorcap. Nina, I appreciate you doing this recommendation. I strongly support the SRNL as well. I thought it was very interesting with Dr. Mikowski's presentation. I know I asked a question, maybe you did too, or other ones did, about the funding. And he was pretty clear, at least in my mind, that no, we're like, all our research work is being funded by the organizations that we're doing work for. We're self-funded. And I said, and I thought to myself, that doesn't make any sense. Their core mission is environmental management. I mean, that's why we're discussing them, and we're allowed to discuss them. So why they wouldn't be funded by the federal government in lieu of other national labs that aren't they seem to be the top national lab on a national basis. So I think it's good that you wrote this in a recommendation format, and I'm with you 100% on it. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was you and Tom and maybe Gil that asked those questions, and I was really surprised. I guess I just always assumed base funding for a national lab. I guess it's one of those things about when you assume. So I'm glad that you kept asking those questions.
This is Dan Kaminsky, Cap. Just a quick question. What is Gray QB technology?
That was in Dr. Mikowski's presentation and online about the national lab, and I don't know. I don't know is the good answer to that.
The thing that when Dr. Mikowski talked, it was the camera that could identify radiation and also produce an image and overlay them.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Zach Todd, DOE. Just a couple thoughts and stuff. When you say base federal funding, do you mean like appropriations, like from a PBS level? Is that what you're referring to?
I would think so. I think that's what the way we understood it. Do you think we should add the word PBS to that?
Or like appropriated funds, or like something to that
Doesn't
nature.
have to be a PBS, but
Correct.
an appropriation, yes.
Yeah. Now, just in food for thought, so we do fund the national lab through the indirect side, which is kind of a tax on the PBSs or the direct programs. It's a derivative of a percentage. Now, and this has been talked about a lot through the Department of Energy, because we have talked about exactly this. When you put something on the direct side appropriated, you put it underneath congressional control, so you lose some of the flexibility and stuff. So, for instance, you have liquid waste, they're funding at a certain point, and that's their pot of money. In essence, it's protected, and you're going to be putting the national lab right there with it, where in theory it sounds really good because you have a dedicated pot of money, but necessarily sometimes congressional they put these caveats and stuff like that with how the money is spent, so or what to do with that money. So just something to think about. My thought would be to kind of like acknowledge that there is a difference, and like would there be like maybe a gain from moving it to the direct.
Yeah. Bob Durkab, Zach, thank you for your comments. Those are very good. It's almost like you're answering the question for us, though, which is that, like Nina's raising the question with this recommendation, and I think that's kind of like what we'd expect in the response that we would get to this recommendation. Because, the whole point is that, well, I think I'm speaking for the entire cab, but, everyone likes SRNL. They like the work that they're doing, but yet we were confused, again, by Dr. Mikowski's response in regards to, not getting any funding from DOE, and yet funding was going to other national labs. So we just feel, that this, in my opinion, this is a great opportunity for the CAB to support SRNL as strongly as we can.
Bob, agree completely. I think this is a great recommendation. I was just trying to help you get it into a little bit better, question. That way you can get a little bit better answer from us. That's all.
Okay. Well, I mean, is your suggestion that maybe we should be more specific in terms of the funding or something like that, or what do you think?
I'll leave the indirect, direct part up to y'all, but I would definitely adjust the language with the base funding to move that towards like an appropriated thing.
Okay.
And perhaps maybe, so if we say something along the bottom line there of budget projections, which would be needed for baseline funding in form of appropriations, which would increase their overall budget, because that's our intent, correct?
I think a simple word fix to be more specific here would be right before the last two words, base funding, insert the word direct. And that's it. Because we are advocating direct base funding, not indirect.
Chelsea, are you editing this?
I am.
All right. Nina, obviously you wrote this, so
That's good
if you're
feedback.
comfortable with,
So
we're talking about the recommendation specifically,
Yeah,
right?
so,
Okay.
so
So can
just
we
getting
go
my
down
arms
to the
around what you really
recommendation,
want out of the recommendation, I get the sense that we want to reward them in the sense of their performance to give them a larger budget to do more things, correct?
No, this isn't about a larger budget. It's more giving them a solid base of funding rather than having to sing for their supper every year among its customers. That's I know what a business does, but that's not how most federal agencies work, and that lends a great deal of instability to their future planning when they have to operate that way. Some amount of base funding gives them stability for planning purposes.
Okay.
I like adding that. So, Chelsea, can you do that so after in the recommendation for base funding for stability purposes? for stability, I don't know if like stability purposes, but that was actually kind of my thinking behind the recommendation. And I don't think it could happen, but I was just wondering if, for instance, another lab or another private company opened, let's say in Atlanta, and they could do almost the same exact things that maybe the lab could do at a fraction of the price. If there's no base funding and the lab is reliant on these projects, if next year they lost, I don't know, half the projects or a third, would that mean there could be layoffs? Would that mean that a lot of the programs would shrink? And that was my thought for base funding.
Bob
Yeah,
Dorcap,
and
I
also,
think.
one of the things that, this is Tom French, if I can comment, one of the things that Zach said was if you have your own PBS, then you're vulnerable to Congress. On the other hand, if you're depending on the other PBSs to fund you and they take a cut, it passes directly to the lab immediately. So there's no, if you have base funding, then you have some cushion that you can deal with it, move your people to other places. We actually have an expert in the audience who might want to make a comment later.
Yeah, let me introduce myself. I'm Sharon Mayer. I'm the Deputy Director of SRNL. I was not at Terry's presentation in Charleston, but if I can answer any specific questions, I would be glad to. But the comments you just made were very accurate as far as it is really a stability question for us in the future. So, and if there's any specific questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Thank you.
Bob, what were you saying?
No, I was just going to, I like the changes that we've made to this recommendation. I think that you've initiated the response that I would feel very favorable about, but I think the comments that have been made by Tom and by David in regards to, stability and funding and, does it need to be a specific PBS? It sounds like no, but SRNL should be, it should be very clear, at least from the CAB's perspective, that they're getting good funding and adequate funding because they're a high-performance organization, again, in my opinion. So I think the changes we've made to the recommendation look really good, if you're comfortable with it.
Yeah, I am.
And
I think
hopefully the
good
rest.
feedback.
Okay. Are there any other comments in regards to this recommendation? Public? Dave Ovakis, do you have anything? Okay.
Bob, I can only hear you on most of the conversation is inaudible, so
Oh.
I really have nothing to add.
Okay, I'm going to remind everyone who's making comments to please speak into a microphone because that's the only way Dave Ovakis can hear. Thank you. You can hear me, right, Dave?
Yes, I can hear you fine, but
Great.
I can't hear much of the other, what's coming across most of the other microphones. But I don't think it's a problem with the speakers. I think it's probably something with the technology. I don't know.
It's probably me. Nobody could ever hear me, so it's not you.
Okay.
I can't hear what was said there.
You got to get right up on it.
She's trying to be nice,
Trying
Dave.
to be. No one hears me.
Seriously, I did not hear.
Okay. Well, Bob.
Dave, can you hear this? I think it's the phone microphone's not picking it up.
That's what it is.
Maybe
Oh.
maybe put the phone microphone closer to the speaker.
That's a good idea.
Oh, no, that's these little guys. Well, Bob, I'd like to make a motion that we forward this recommendation to the full board for their consideration.
I second.
Okay, we've had a motion and a second. And the motion is to accept this recommendation from the committee level and to forward it on to the full board for the November meeting. Are there any other comments that need to be made regarding this recommendation? Okay, there's no other comments. All those in favor of moving this recommendation forward to the full board, please raise your hand. Okay. Dave Ovakis, yes or no? Dave? Okay.
I vote in favor.
Okay, thank you. All those not in favor of moving this recommendation forward? Okay, there were no...
Yeah, I vote in favor.
Dave, you voted in favor. We're asking for any not in favor. Okay, there's no not in favor, so this recommendation will move forward to the full board in the November meeting. Thank you. Okay, next on our committee discussion is to talk about the presentations we had in September regarding the budget update and the SRNL, annual update that we received. So I'm going to ask the committee at this time if they have any questions or want to potentially create any recommendations in regards to what we received or the presentations that we had in September. And I'll start with the budget update. Is there any? Okay, is there someone else who's attending online? All right. Okay, Deidre, you're welcome. And Deidre, I don't know if you heard, we're now discussing the presentations that we had in September at the full board meeting in Charleston. And we were going to talk about the budget update first from John Lopez with DOE. Anybody want to start, or I have a comment? Go ahead.
David Hoyle Cab, I noticed during that discussion that operational support, one of the major categories in the integrated priority list, includes payments in lieu of taxes funding. And that's quite a chunk of money that DOE provides to local counties to make up for their loss of tax revenue from the land that Savannah River site sits on. What's a little upsetting is I believe it was either the House or the Senate in their budget deliberations this year. One of those houses has voted to zero out payment in lieu of taxes funding, and I think this was discussed a little bit at the full board meeting. I don't know that there's anything that the CAB can do in terms of a recommendation in that regard, but that would be quite a hit for the local community if that were to happen. One of the reasons I read that Congress is doing that is their criticism of DOE on calculating payment of lieu of taxes was being the criteria that was being applied across various DOE sites was being done inconsistently. Now, I don't know what that means, but that was the criticism that I read in the newspapers. And when we asked John about this, he said that that SRS was following whatever criteria that they were supposed to, but obviously somebody's not, otherwise Congress wouldn't be upset about it. I don't know, I just bring that up. That was a big deal in my opinion.
Yep, Bob Dorcab, I think that's a very good issue that you've noted here, that funding at the or pass-through money, if you will, at the local level, that's been legislated at the by the U.S. Congress,
Right.
Is in question, and I think it's something we can track. I think there is a potential there for a recommendation, if just as like a fact-finding thing to track it, but maybe
I suppose we could. This might even be a recommendation that we don't necessarily address to Savannah Riverside EM, but to headquarters EM, and that maybe we should recommend they get their act together and make sure that their PILT calculations are consistent so that they don't jeopardize PILT funding. That's maybe an idea.
No, I like that idea. I know for myself, this is Bob Dorcab again. I know for myself with the budget update that we received from John Lopez, Nina Spinelli had raised the issue about could we adjust the work plan for the Strategic and Legacy Management Committee to get a presentation on cybersecurity. Now that money's being appropriated for the EM budget to deal with, or to to work, understand, to work through the issue of cybersecurity. And when this was pursued with DOE, the issue was, well, that there's a lot of secret stuff going on, that can't be classified. I don't know what you want to call it. And it was felt by CAB support that it would be hard for DOE or the contractors that are involved with cybersecurity to discuss or divulge any information about the cybersecurity plans at DOE, and yet significant dollars are being spent. So I think the thought process going forward here is that what happens, I think starting in January of 2018, we get in, the CAB gets involved again with the integrated priority list. And this group starts developing its position on the IPL, but we also get a presentation on the funding again. And if Nina, I think Nina had a good point, in my opinion, about the cybersecurity, and can the CAB learn more about it? Can we support something that you're already that DOE is already doing, or can we make suggestions that DOE could do more with cybersecurity than they're already doing? We'll learn about the funding. I think, if I remember right, with the IPL from 2017, that we put cybersecurity. I thought we elevated it in our IPL. I don't have the IPL in front of me, but I'm just going to make that comment that this committee, outside of this meeting today, made an inquiry into could we adjust the strategic and legacy management work plan for 2017 to hear more about cybersecurity, and basically we were told, well, it would be difficult to do that because of the security, classified information, whatever. But somehow I think we ought to be able to find a way to hear more about cybersecurity. So I know, Nina, you saw the response back from CAB support on that.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect summary, Bob.
All right, thanks.
David Hoyle, CAB. Pam, could you comment on whether cybersecurity is part of the EM mission, or is that a different program within DOE?
No, it's part of, this is Pam Marks, DOE. It's part of all the missions, is integrated part of our mission. So it's not funded by a separate office, it's an inherent element. And so the Department of Energy has its own cybersecurity organization that reports up through higher levels in the department.
Okay.
So
So we wouldn't be out of scope by trying to learn more about Savannah Riverside cybersecurity plans.
no, I don't believe that would be the case.
Okay. Bob, this is David Hoyle again. At the full board meeting during John's presentation, and we started talking about IPLs and how they were comparing across fiscal years, I asked him if we could get the latest releasable IPL, which would be fiscal year 18. Have you received that yet?
No, I have not.
Okay. Chelsea, could you help us get a copy of that?
Yeah, Bob Dorcab, we could have that for the December
Yeah.
committee meeting.
Yeah.
David, that's what you said actually just got me thinking with the cybersecurity. I think the reason I brought it up is if you look at that budget table, I was confused. The bottom of it, the SR0025 for cybersecurity, how it's combined now with safeguards and security. And I think that's where the question came from, was essentially how much is going to cybersecurity. And there was a discussion, I think it was either Bob or Gil, sort of about reinventing the wheel. And I think everyone at a site, like a complex wide level, is looking at cybersecurity. So I think that's kind of where our thoughts were with it, was how much of the money is sort of going to cybersecurity. And when we do the integrated priority list, if next year that's something that we should look at, is increasing it.
Right, and John indicated, and so does this table, that approximately 22 million was requested for FY18 by EM Savannah River for cybersecurity, PBS 25.
And then I guess the mark came back as 0. And then it was combined with
Right.
20 and
To being
25.
combined,
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, Bob Dorcab again, too. And just to support what Nina was talking about as well, there's money being appropriated and then, requested, and then we're waiting to see, what the budget's going to be and how the Congress is going to mark it up. It was just, I just thought it was interesting that we couldn't really know what they're working on because it needs to be confidential, classified, whatever. And then, I think there's an opportunity, I guess that's all I'm going to say going forward, that the CAB could, I don't see any reason why the CAB wouldn't support increased cybersecurity by DOE at SRS, but we need to get some kind of understanding, a better understanding of what that cybersecurity is without having DOE release confidential information as public information that could be used against DOE with cybersecurity. I guess that's the concern. But
So Bob, Dan Kaminsky, CAP, I had asked that question about whether people are sharing across boundaries, but I was beyond Department of Energy was really the scope of my question, because we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars nearby Fort Gordon for their cybersecurity operations. And the response when I asked that specific question, I got the impression, at least, that this is just a portion, sort of like a tax of the EM budget that goes into the bigger bucket of cybersecurity for Department of Energy. But I did get the sense that they had more or less their own cybersecurity department, or whatever you want to call it, and they weren't necessarily in coordination with outside agencies such as what we see going up in Augusta.
Bob Dorcab again. See, I thought it was interesting when Dr. Mikowski, again, was talking about the Savannah River Nuclear Lab, and then he was talking about, I don't know if it was theory or what they were actually developing, but SRNL was being contracted to do cybersecurity work where, they had this thing with, GPS location and, stopping intrusions into IT systems with, recognizing where you were located. And so, thinking, well, is that, obviously that couldn't be that confidential if you're talking about that. So, and yet EM dollars are being spent in the budget. So what CAB support had recommended to me when we talked about a work plan adjustment for this committee was, for 2017, was, well, when John Lopez talks about the integrated priority list for 2018 and talks about funding for, for that integrated priority list, that we could ask very specific questions about what you're doing with cybersecurity, who's doing it. I know I asked the questions, is there a special contractor for cybersecurity, are the current contractors responsible individually for their own cybersecurity? What's DOE doing? It seemed like there was a presentation that could be made there, but yet there's security issue. So
Yeah, Dan again. I believe you're right, and there certainly is localized cybersecurity efforts. I mean, for even our company interface with SRNL with regards to power grid security. So yeah, I definitely know that there is some significant involvement, and maybe this 22 million does in fact just correlate to what's happening on site. But I would suspect that their overall cybersecurity is much larger than what we see at the site. Does anyone from DOE can confirm or deny that perception?
Lamb to slaughter. Zach Todd, DOE. Just not going to comment at this time, honestly. I think you guys raised some interesting questions and stuff. It'd be something to explore, but we can talk to some of our security folks and our cybersecurity folks specifically. My initial thought is it's going to be pretty tough for you guys to get a brief that's worthwhile, but again, that's just me without exploring and asking any questions. So my thought. Any further questions on that?
thank you, Zach. Yeah, I mean, that's consistent with what we...
Yeah. I'm not going to deviate from that.
You can still have a cookie.
Oh.
If needed.
Okay. Is there anyone else in the committee or the public that would like to raise any issues regarding the budget update presentation?
Dan Kaminsky again. I just want to shout out another good accolade for Mr. Lopez with his presentation. I know Gil would, if he were here, he'd definitely be chiming in saying it's the highlight of the meetings. He loves poring over these figures. It's pretty well, for the most part, easy to understand. And I think a whole lot of our concerns are going to be sort of culminating in our ad hoc committee later in the month. So, that's the last page of the presentation. So I suspect our true concerns are kind of being tabled for that committee.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Bob Dorcab again. So the next point of our committee discussion is the annual update that we received from the Savannah River Nuclear Lab. Does anybody have any comments in regards to that presentation?
I have just one comment, if I might.
Go ahead, Tom.
This is Tom French. I'm not being picky. It's National Lab.
Oh, I'm sorry. What did they say? Nuclear Lab? I'm sorry. Yes, you're Savannah River National Lab.
Yes, it's the,
No, you're absolutely right. Yep.
Sorry.
I should just use the acronym, then I don't get in trouble.
We'll make you conform.
Yep. Bob Dorcab again. I think that Nina's recommendation kind of speaks for the SRNL. And I, for one, really like the SRNL. I think that they do great work. When you're talking about taxpayer dollars and doing things that are worthwhile for society here in the United States, the SRNL is right at the top. So we'll take that recommendation to the full board, and I would assume that we'll get positive response on that. Okay. Are there any other comments that anyone would like to make regarding SRNL? Go ahead.
A couple of things in my notes from that briefing. One was we got a rather vague response when we asked Terry what the status of the Advanced Materials Collaborative is with USC Aiken, because what you read in the newspapers about them going back to the drawing board in terms of funding sounds quite dire, but he tended to paint it as just a bump in the road. I hope he's right, because that would mean a great deal to the local community to establish that laboratory at USC Aiken. But that may be something we want to delve more into in our next work plan to get an update on that, perhaps. The other big deal I thought that was discussed briefly was the fact that some of the research at SRNL has shown some progress in terms of developing a graphene filtration medium for tritium. Tritium's the one contaminant out at Savannah River site that, other than sending it up the stack and diluting it with air, there really is no treatment technology for removing tritium from the environment. And if that were to pan out, that would be a huge innovation, and something we ought to keep our eyes on too.
Bob Dorcap, Dave, I think I was listening to what you were saying. I think that sounds like two good topics for recommendations in the future. Historically, this committee has just been saying, SRNL, you're doing a great job. We like your presentations, but we want to get you funding. But actually asking DOE, SRNL to comment on specific plans, projects, certainly in regards to tritium, it would be very interesting to get a presentation on that, if that's what the recommendation involved, or asking specific questions about what they're doing. Okay. Any other comments in regards to SRNL and that update? Public? Okay. Okay. At this point, we have the public comment period scheduled. And so would anyone from the public like to come up and make a comment? We have a microphone here for you to say anything. Okay, I don't think we have any public comment. Unless there's any other reason, I'd like to call this meeting adjourned.
Oh, one more thing.
Thank you, Bob.
Hold on.
Just one more thing. We mentioned this last night at the committee meetings, and I'd just like to repeat it. In fact, we were talking a little bit about it even before the meeting began, in that this is the time of year for committee members to be suggesting topics to committee chairmen as potential topics to add to the calendar year 18 work plan. Those work plans are drawn up early in 2018, and now's the time to get your suggestions into your committee chairman, and that goes for this committee as well as others.
Dave, thank you for that comment. I agree with you. I think that's being proactive. That's what will happen in 2018. I know in February, typically the committee meets with the new CAB members and the established CAB members, and you develop the work plan with your experts from DOE for the coming year, but you don't have to wait till February. So now's the time to start doing it. And I think, Nina brought up the issue with the cybersecurity. Could we amend the 2017 plan? And the answer is yes, you can amend the committee's work plan during the year. You've got to get DDFO approval to do it, but it can be done. So if something becomes a hot topic, don't think you have to wait to raise the issue and amend the approved work plan for the year. So I know Nina and I are getting off the board this year, so our time is limited in terms of what we can get involved in. But certainly the current CAB members should, if you really have something that as of interest, you should bring it up, and bring it up here at the committee meetings. I think it's a great place to do it. Okay. Again, is there any other business that needs to be discussed? Tom, I'm sorry, go ahead, David. David, go ahead. Go ahead.
Bob, do you have any preference as to how you would like to receive those recommendations for the work plan?
Emails.
I would, Bob Dorcab. David, what I would recommend, unless somebody has another idea, is email those work plan ideas to the CAB support. You know, James Tanner specifically, and then of course James will get it back to the committee chairs. And if there's a reason to amend the current work plan for a different presentation, that would happen in the current work plan year. And then, but also getting those work plan ideas for the 2018 work plan would, as David Hoyle suggested, would be very valuable. Why wait till February? Do it now. Did you hear that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Bob, a comment on that? I'd also encourage, beyond the email, I'd encourage bringing it to the meeting during our open discussion because of two things. One, it could certainly ground some support. And secondly, it could be a trigger to have another excellent work plan idea or recommendation idea.
Yeah, that's fine as well. Yeah, certainly, right, because it becomes a matter of record here when you discuss it. Yes, that's fine. Tom French, I think you had a discussion point that we were talking before the meeting. And would you like to raise that now?
Yeah, we were having an off-record chatter, and they pointed out I should probably make it public. The Savannah site is a NERP, so it's a National Environmental Research Park. And as David pointed out, it was the first one designated in the United States. Hanford is another one. And it is under the custodianship of the Office of Science, and it's under the custodianship of the University of Georgia here at the site. So it is, but EM owns all the property, so they're the landlord. This all falls under their footprint. But the NERP, for people that don't really understand the site, it is the most studied piece of closed environment in the United States. So we fenced it off, put guards all around it, and then we've had scientists out there, we've had Forest Service out there, we've had all kinds of people out there mapping everything. The geology, soil types, there's a fault that runs through the site, it's been mapped, all the water courses subsurface and above surface. So there's a whole lot known about that site. And since this is a legacy management organization, I was recommending that we should look at figuring out a way to open this up to the public in some limited fashion. Because there are things out the site which I have seen, but most citizens will never get a chance to see. I mean, it's an absolutely phenomenal piece of property. So that was my recommendation. I'll craft a recommendation. I'll learn more about the NERP and put it in the work plan.
Tom, thank you very much. Now, I'm glad you made that comment before and you made the comment now. I think that's very appropriate. And there is a process to deal with that, and we'll get it on the work plan, or it should get on the work plan, or it's certainly something to discuss for the work plan. Okay. Are there any other comments, last minute things? I think I tried to remember everything that was going to be discussed. I'm encouraging anybody to, we've got plenty of time here. It's only 20 to 6. Is there anything else to discuss? Okay. I'll just say I'm anxious to get home and watch the Yankees play. I think they're going to win tonight. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.